Why would a dead person need beer? This question seems strange, but for the ancient Egyptians, it was the key to eternity. They built tombs not as places of mourning, but as full-fledged homes for the afterlife, filled with everything necessary. We are used to thinking that pharaohs were buried with food simply so that they would not go hungry. But the truth is much more complex and interesting. It was a whole system of magical rituals where every jug of beer and every loaf of bread played its own vital role. Watch this video to the end, and you will learn why not only food, but also entire fields and breweries were painted on the walls of tombs, and how a simple list of products could guarantee the pharaoh eternal bliss. What if I told you that the food in the tombs was not meant to be eaten in the sense we understand it? For the ancient Egyptians, death was not the end, but merely a transition to another state, to a world ruled by gods and spirits. In this world, the human soul, the Ka and Ba, continued to exist but needed constant nourishment. The real food left in the tomb was just a starter kit for the journey. The Egyptians understood perfectly well that bread would go stale and beer would spoil. Therefore, they developed an ingenious system of eternal supply based on magic. The main source of energy for the soul was not the food itself, but its essence. The Egyptians believed that an image of an object or its name, written in hieroglyphs, carried the same magical power as the object itself. It was a kind of eternal duplicate. Therefore, the walls of the tombs were covered with thousands of images of food. Mountains of bread, roasted geese, bunches of grapes, and vessels of wine. These images were magically activated and nourished the Ka of the deceased throughout eternity. The richer and more varied the painted table, the more comfortable the afterlife would be. In addition to drawings, models played a huge role. Entire miniature bakeries, breweries, and livestock yards made of wood or clay have been found in tombs. It was believed that these models, thanks to rituals, came to life in the afterlife and produced real food for the pharaoh. It was a kind of insurance in case the real offering stopped. The living could forget about the deceased, the priest could stop their services, but the magical images and models worked forever. They were a guarantee that the soul would never go hungry. But even that was not enough. The most reliable method was considered to be the sacrificial list. It was a long list of products carved on the wall of the tomb. Even simply pronouncing these names aloud during the ritual activated their magical essence and turned them into real food for the soul. Thus, food in the tomb was not just provisions. It was a complex, multi-level mechanism that combined real food, its images, models, and written lists. All of this worked toward one goal: to ensure an eternal and uninterrupted supply of energy to the soul. This system shows how rational and practical the Egyptians' thinking was, even in matters of faith. They did not simply hope for the mercy of the gods, but created a reliable, almost engineering-like system to ensure their afterlife. Their tombs were not just graves, but autonomous machines for eternal existence. I'm very interested to hear your point of view. What do you think about such a pragmatic approach to magic and the afterlife? Write about it in the comments. Want to know a secret that will change your perception of the pharaoh's diet? Bread and beer were not just staple foods in ancient Egypt. They were symbols of life and civilization itself. These two products formed the basis of both the daily diet of the living and the afterlife offerings for the deceased. Their importance was so great that the workers who built the pyramids were paid in bread and beer. It was a stable and understandable currency. Therefore, it is not surprising that these products played a central role in the afterlife. Dozens of varieties of bread and flatbread of various shapes have been found in tombs. There were conical, oval, triangular, and even animal-shaped loaves. Each shape had its own ritual significance and was intended for specific ceremonies. Bread symbolized the creative power of the earth and rebirth. It was made from wheat and barley, grains that died and rose again every year during sowing and harvesting. For the Egyptians, this cycle was a vivid example of eternal life. Beer was considered the drink of the gods, given to humans by Osiris himself. It was not so much an alcoholic beverage for entertainment as an important food product. Egyptian beer was thick, filling, and resembled liquid porridge, being an important source of calories and vitamins. The brewing process was often depicted on the walls of tombs. We see scenes where women grind grain, prepare bread leaven, and filter wort. These images ensured that the deceased would never be without their favorite drink. There were many varieties of beer: sweet, dark, light, and iron. The names of these varieties were listed in sacrificial lists. It was believed that the soul of the deceased could choose any variety to its liking. Bread and beer were always mentioned together as an inseparable pair. In funeral prayers, priests asked for 1,000 loaves of bread and 1,000 jugs of beer for the deceased. This was a standard formula that ensured the basic needs of the soul in the afterlife. Archaeologists find not only real loaves of bread and sealed vessels in tombs, but also their clay models. These models were an eternal, imperishable version of real products. They performed the same magical function as the drawings on the walls. Thus, bread and beer were not just food for the Egyptians, but sacred substances. They were the basis of prosperity both on earth and in the fields of Ayalu, the Egyptian paradise. What modern product do you think could become an equally indispensable symbol for our civilization? But what if I told you that, in addition to simple food, something was placed in the tombs that was supposed to magically multiply it? Read on to the next chapter to learn about the mystery of the offering tables. What I am about to show you is something you have never seen before. We already know that drawings and models of food could magically nourish the soul. But how exactly did this process work? There were special ritual objects and ceremonies that were the key to activating the entire system of afterlife nourishment. The central element of any burial chamber was the sacrificial table. This was not ordinary furniture, but a stone slab, most often made of alabaster or granite. Relief images of various foods were carved on its surface: bread, meat, vegetables, and vessels with drinks. It was believed that any real food placed on such a table would magically multiply and turn into an eternal source of sustenance. During rituals, priests placed real offerings on the slab, which were then copied into the afterlife in infinite quantities. It was a kind of magical photocopier. Special grooves and recesses were often made on such tables. They were intended for ritual libations. Priests poured water, wine, or beer onto the table. The liquid flowing over the carved images of food magically revived them and made them available to the soul of the deceased. But in order for the soul to consume this food, it was necessary to perform a very important ritual: opening of the mouth and eyes. The Egyptians believed that after death, statues and mummies could not see, speak, or eat. This ritual was supposed to restore these abilities to them in the afterlife. During the ceremony, the priest symbolically touched the mouth, eyes, and ears of the statue or sarcophagus with special instruments. These actions were accompanied by the recitation of magic spells. It was believed that after this, the statue came to life and gained the ability to receive offerings. It was this revived statue, the vessel of the Ka's soul, that consumed the essence of the food left on the sacrificial table. The physical food remained in place, but its spiritual energy was transferred to the deceased. This process was invisible to the living, but absolutely real to the Egyptians. The opening of the mouth ritual was not only performed during funerals, it could be repeated during special holidays to recharge the statue's magical abilities. This was necessary to maintain the smooth operation of the eternal nourishment system. Thus, the entire complex system of drawings, models, and sacrificial tables was useless without this key ritual. It was this ritual that closed the circle and allowed the pharaoh's soul to enjoy an eternal feast. It was the final activation of the immortality machine. This complex interrelationship between physical objects, images, and rituals shows how deeply thought out the Egyptian concept of the afterlife was. It was not just a belief, but a real technology developed to defeat death. Are you ready for the shocking truth about the pharaoh's diet? Meat in ancient Egypt was a real luxury, available to only a select few. While ordinary people ate mainly bread, vegetables, and fish, for the elite, meat dishes were a symbol of status and wealth. Naturally, the pharaoh could not do without this attribute of luxury in the afterlife. Therefore, meat offerings occupied a place of honor in burial chambers. Their variety was intended to emphasize the high status of the deceased. Beef was the most common type of meat. The bull was considered a sacred animal, a symbol of strength and fertility. The most valuable parts of the carcass, such as the front leg, were sacrificed and placed in the tomb. On the walls, we see detailed depictions of entire slaughterhouses. Artists meticulously drew all stages, from the slaughter of the bull to the cutting of the carcass and the preparation of the meat. These scenes ensured that the pharaoh would always have access to fresh beef. In addition to beef, goat, and sheep meat was also placed in the tombs. Various types of game, such as antelope and gazelle, were also popular. Hunting these animals was a favorite pastime of the nobility, and hunting scenes were also often depicted on the walls. Birds occupied a special place. Mummified geese, ducks, and pigeons, cooked and placed in special wooden boxes, have been found in burial chambers. It was believed that this was the favorite food of the gods, and therefore ideal for the pharaoh. Fish, despite its prevalence in the diet of ordinary Egyptians, is less common in tombs. Some species of fish were associated with the myth of Osiris and were considered unclean. Therefore, only noble varieties were chosen for the pharaoh's afterlife menu. In addition to real meat, numerous models of it were placed in the tombs. Clay or wooden figurines of roasted geese or ox legs were supposed to serve as an eternal, imperishable substitute for real food. Magic turned them into real food. All this abundance of meat was not just a demonstration of wealth. It had a deep ritual meaning. Meat symbolized the vitality and energy that the deceased needed for rebirth in the afterlife. Thus, the pharaoh's meat menu was carefully thought out. It was supposed to provide him not only with his usual and status food, but also with magical energy for eternal life. What do you find most surprising about this menu? But how did the Egyptians preserve all these foods so that they would not spoil? In the next chapter, you will learn about ancient methods of preservation and storage. In addition to beer, which was an everyday drink, the Egyptian nobility highly valued wine. Vineyards were grown mainly in the Nile Delta. Wine was considered an elite drink intended for celebrations and rituals. Dozens of amphorae containing wine were found in the tombs of the pharaohs, especially in the tomb of Tutankhamun. Each amphora had a special label indicating the year of harvest, the origin of the grapes, the name of the winemaker, and even the sweetness of the drink. This detailed information was important not only for afterlife feasts, it also allows modern historians to better understand the economy and trade of ancient Egypt. We know which vineyards were considered the best and who supplied wine to the pharaoh's court. Wine was associated with the blood of Osiris and had important ritual significance. It was used in temple services and during funeral ceremonies. It was believed that wine granted eternal youth and helped the deceased to be reborn. In addition to wine, other beverages were also placed in tombs. For example, milk. It symbolized childhood and rebirth and was associated with the mother goddess Isis, who nursed her son Horus. All these vessels were carefully sealed with clay stoppers and resin. This was done in order to preserve the contents for as long as possible. The Egyptians were masters of preservation, and their techniques allowed products to be preserved for millennia. The variety of beverages in the tomb reflected the wealth and status of its owner. The more different types of wine and other valuable liquids there were in the burial chamber, the higher the person's position in life. It was a final statement of their power and influence. What if I showed you a time machine? That's exactly what the burial chambers of the pharaohs can be called, preserving for us the gifts of the Egyptian land. In addition to bread, meat, and drinks, the afterlife menu necessarily included a variety of fruits and vegetables. The land of Egypt, irrigated by the Nile, was incredibly fertile. The Egyptians grew many crops, and the best of them were destined for the pharaoh's table, both earthly and afterlife. These gifts of nature were supposed to provide him with vitamins for eternity. One of the most popular fruits was the fig. It was valued for its sweetness and nutritional value. Whole baskets of dried figs, which have been perfectly preserved for thousands of years, have been found in tombs. Dates were also highly valued. The date palm was considered the tree of life, and its fruits were a symbol of abundance. Dates were eaten fresh, dried, and also made into a sweet syrup similar to honey. Grapes were not only used as raw material for wine, they were also dried to make raisins, which were an important source of energy. Bunches of fresh grapes were often depicted on the walls of tombs as a symbol of fertility and eternal celebration. Of all the vegetables, onions were the most important. They had enormous ritual significance and were associated with eternal life and energy. Bunches of onions were not only placed in tombs, but sometimes even placed in the eye sockets of mummies. in the belief that this would help the deceased see in the afterlife. Garlic, lettuce, cucumbers, and melons have also been found in burials. All these vegetables were part of the daily diet and accordingly had to be present on the afterlife table. Their images adorn the walls of many tombs. In addition to fruits, seeds were also placed in the tombs. This was another magical safeguard. It was believed that new plants would grow from these seeds in the fields of Ialu and bear fruit forever for the deceased. All these plant offerings symbolize an unbreakable connection with the fertile land of Egypt. They were a guarantee that even in the world of the dead, the pharaoh would enjoy the gifts of the generous Nile Valley. Which of these products do you think are still popular today? But how did all these vast quantities of supplies get into the tomb? And who was responsible for their preservation? In the next chapter, we will talk about the priests and ministers of the funerary cult. Providing the pharaoh with food in the afterlife was only half the battle. Someone also had to prepare and serve this food. For this purpose, the Egyptians came up with an ingenious solution: ushabti figurines. Ushabti are small figurines, usually in the shape of a mummy, which were placed in the tomb. They were made of wood, stone, or faience. Each figurine had a special spell from the Book of the Dead written on it. This spell was supposed to bring the figurine to life in the afterlife. If the gods called the deceased to work, for example, to cultivate the fields of Ialu, the ushabti had to respond, "I am here," and do all the work for its owner. They were eternal servants and workers. The richer the person, the more ushabti there were in their tomb. In some burials, hundreds of them were found. It was considered ideal to have 365 ushabti, one for each day of the year, as well as 36 overseers to manage them. In addition to the ushabti, who were universal workers, models depicting specific processes were placed in the tombs. We have already mentioned miniature bakeries and breweries. These models were populated by figures of people busy with their work. We see bakers kneading dough, brewers filtering beer, and butchers cutting up carcasses. It was believed that these scenes would magically come to life in the afterlife. They created the complete illusion of a working economy serving the pharaoh. These models are an invaluable source of information for historians. They show in detail how various industries were organized in ancient Egypt. We can study the tools, technologies, and organization of labor of that time. This system allowed the pharaoh to maintain his royal status in the afterlife. He did not need to work. An entire army of magical servants and workers provided him with everything he needed, from bread to beer. Thus, the concept of the afterlife completely mirrored the world of the living. It had its own economy, its own production, and its own social hierarchy. And the ushabti and models were key elements of this eternal, magical economy. This once again demonstrates the practicality of the Egyptians. They did not simply believe in paradise, they designed it in detail, creating a working model of an ideal world for their eternal existence. To ensure the preservation of food for millennia, the ancient Egyptians used preservation technologies that were advanced for their time. They understood perfectly well that without special treatment, food would quickly spoil. Their methods were so effective that many products have survived to this day in a recognizable form. The main method of preserving meat and poultry was salting and drying. The carcasses were rubbed with natron, a natural salt that was also used for mummification. Natron drew out moisture, preventing the growth of bacteria and decay. After being treated with salt, the meat and poultry were dried in the sun. In the dry and hot climate of Egypt, this process took place quite quickly. The result was a product similar to modern basturma or jerky, which could be stored for a very long time. Fruits such as figs and dates were also dried. This was the simplest and most reliable way to preserve their sweet taste and nutritional properties. Grapes were turned into raisins. Grain for bread and beer was stored in special granaries. Clay models of such granaries have been found in tombs. These were tall structures with several compartments that protected the harvest from moisture and pests. Clay amphorae and jugs were used to store liquid products such as wine, beer, and oil. The neck of the vessel was tightly sealed with a clay stopper, which was sometimes additionally coated with resin for complete airtightness. This protected the contents from contact with air. All these supplies were carefully arranged and placed in the burial chamber. Special wooden boxes and woven baskets were often used for this purpose. Each item had its place in strict order. Surprisingly, these ancient methods are in many ways similar to those used today. Drying, salting, and curing are all basic principles of preservation discovered thousands of years ago. The Egyptians intuitively understood the biochemical processes underlying them. Thanks to this skill, we can literally look into the pantries of the pharaohs today. The food found in the tombs is not just artifacts, but direct evidence of the diet and daily life of people who lived more than 3,000 years ago. Of course, the pharaoh's comfort in the afterlife was not limited to food alone. The tomb was his eternal home, and it had to contain everything necessary for a full life befitting his status. Therefore, the burial chambers were filled with many other items. The most important part of the burial inventory was furniture. Beds, chairs, tables, and chests for storing things are found in tombs. Often, this furniture was a true work of art, made of precious woods and decorated with gold and ivory. The pharaoh had to look appropriate in the afterlife. Therefore, his clothes, sandals, and numerous decorations were placed in the tomb. Necklaces, bracelets, rings, and pectorals made of gold and precious stones were intended to emphasize his royal status. Leisure activities were not forgotten either. Board games such as Senet, a game symbolizing the soul's journey through the afterlife, have been found in burials. Musical instruments such as harps and lutes were also placed in tombs. Of course, ritual objects were also placed in the tomb. Amulets for protection, magic wands, and spells from the Book of the Dead on papyrus scrolls. All of this was necessary for successfully passing the trials on the way to the afterlife. More than 5,000 different items were found in Tutankhamun's tomb. They were neatly arranged in several rooms, creating the complete illusion of living quarters. This is the most complete picture of royal life that has survived to this day. Every item in the tomb had its purpose. Nothing was random. Everything was carefully selected and placed in accordance with religious beliefs and rituals. Thus, food was only part of a huge and complex set of items intended to ensure eternal life. Together, they created a familiar and comfortable environment for the pharaoh, an exact replica of his earthly palace. This approach shows that the Egyptians did not imagine the afterlife as some kind of abstract spiritual existence. For them, it was a completely material continuation of earthly life with all its needs and pleasures. The tradition of lavish burials with rich offerings existed in Egypt for almost 3 millennia. However, over time, it began to change and gradually fade away. There were several reasons for this, both economic and religious. The construction of tombs and their filling required enormous resources. The country's economy could not always withstand such a burden. During periods of weak central power and decline of the state, the scale of burials was significantly reduced. Another serious problem was the looting of tombs. Despite all the tricks of the builders, most of the royal burials were looted in ancient times. The realization that all the treasures and supplies would not reach the deceased undermined faith in the effectiveness of this system. Over time, religious beliefs themselves changed. In the late period, it was not the material contents of the tomb that became increasingly important, but the moral qualities of the person himself. The judgment of Osiris, where the heart of the deceased was weighed, became the central element of the afterlife belief. Now, it was not mountains of food that were important for justification before the gods, but a righteous life and knowledge of magic spells. The main way to ensure eternity was not the construction of a tomb, but the purchase of papyrus with the text of the Book of the Dead. With the arrival of the Greeks and then the Romans, Egyptian culture began to change significantly. The new rulers brought their own funeral traditions with them. Although mummification continued for some time, the complex ritual of filling tombs gradually became a thing of the past. The final blow to the ancient tradition was dealt by the spread of Christianity and then Islam. The new religions offered a completely different picture of the afterlife, in which there was no place for magical models or sacrificial tables. The ancient gods and rituals were forgotten. Nevertheless, the legacy of this amazing tradition lives on today. Thanks to it, we have invaluable knowledge about the life, customs, art, and technologies of ancient Egypt. The tombs of the pharaohs have become true time capsules. By studying their contents, we can understand what people who lived thousands of years ago believed in, feared, and hoped for. We see how they tried to defeat death with magic, art, and engineering. And although their beliefs are now a thing of the past, their creations continue to amaze and astonish us. The mystery of the Egyptian tombs is not just a story about gold and mummies. It is a story about the greatest attempt in human history to achieve immortality. We have taken a journey into the afterlife of ancient Egypt and seen that the food in the tombs was not just sustenance, but a complex magical tool. Bread, beer, meat, and wine, reproduced in drawings, models, and hieroglyphs, were meant to nourish the pharaoh's soul throughout eternity. This meticulously thought-out system shows how seriously the Egyptians took the preparation for their final journey. Their tombs were not gloomy crypts, but machines for eternal life, stocked with everything necessary. This belief gave rise to great art and architecture that still amazes our imagination today. Which aspect of Egyptian afterlife seems most remarkable to you? Please suggest topics for future videos that you would like to see on our channel in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on new research into the mysteries of ancient civilizations.